I'm a faculty member here in the Department of Anthropology, but I'm also associated with the Center for Asian Studies. And it is the Center for Asian Studies this afternoon that is hosting this interesting panel. So I'm really delighted to welcome you to what promises to be a really fascinating discussion of the ways in which Indian women have become potent symbols in the contemporary global media, as well as within contemporary India, but in very different ways in those two settings. And as hopefully many of us here have thought about, becoming a potent symbol at first glance might seem like a really good thing. But actually, symbols are very rarely fully formed humans in the way that we think of people, and with people with complex opinions or sort of full subjectivity. Symbols are usually silent. So we're really interested in the way in which that symbolism is sort of ironically disempowering sometimes. So in order to discuss this more today, we have this distinguished panel of scholars who have come up in the crummy weather from Colorado Springs today, so thank you very much. I had prepared brief comments, introductory notes for each of the panelists, but in fact, I think that I will defer some of that responsibility to my colleague, Professor Rashna Singh, who is the visiting professor of English and Race and Ethnic Studies at Colorado College and is in many ways the visionary behind today's event. Professor Singh is a scholar of English and has written extensively on British fiction and on children's literature in India, as well as on post-colonial literature. Joining her today are three colleagues, and I'm going to let her introduce them in more detail. Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carla.
Oh, and I am supposed to introduce a few events very briefly.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
We'll steal your thunder briefly. There are a number of other Center for Asian Studies events this semester. Those of you who are from Boulder, we want to make sure that you are aware of these. We're going to circulate these flyers around together with the floor.
So good afternoon, and thank you all for coming out for this panel discussion, including my entire first-year class from Colorado College. So I brought my audience with me. I'm, as Carla introduced me, Rashna Singh, and I would like to first thank the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder, for inviting us to offer this presentation, and particularly Professor Carla Jones, who has worked so hard to bring us here. I would also like to thank Ms. Purvi Mehta for first broaching the idea. And so I'd like to first introduce our panelists, and then I'll share my remarks, and we'll each take turn doing so and have time for a Q&A after. So this is the first panelist here, but she'll be last in order, is Dr. Aditi Mitra from the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and she's assistant professor of sociology there and has written and researched Indian women and NGOs extensively, and has recently published a book called
The Voices of Indian Women.
Voices of Indian Women. And next to her is Dr. Purvi Mehta, getting the surnames mixed up. Dr. Purvi Mehta is an assistant professor of history at Colorado College, and her research area is the Dalit community in India. And next to her is Krithika Vachali, who is a senior English major at Colorado College. So welcome, everyone. And before I start, I just want to sort of, on a personal note, dedicate the remarks of Dr. Mitra and my remarks to our mothers, because we both lost our mothers very early. And today is actually my mother's birthday. So I thought it was very significant that this panel was scheduled for today, because this is personal to us. You know, we were raised by strong Indian women, and we don't recognize the women who are put before us in the Western media often, you know, knowing our own mothers and aunts and others who raised us. So In a TED Talk, Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie warns of the danger of telling a single story. Reportage of the brutal gang rape that took place in Delhi recently has often been told as a single story in American and other Western media. One of Indian women as submissive victims, always in danger from misogynistic, predatory men. As the year 2012 drew to a close, I was in Delhi when it erupted in protests following the gang rape and brutal physical assault of a young woman on a moving bus. As vicious as this crime was, it may have been relegated to the inside pages of the newspapers, and the world may never have heard of it. But perhaps because of its extreme sadism, it became a catalyst for the people of Delhi and India in general, who poured into the streets to protest not only the growing incidence of rape, but the inaction and indifference of the police and the sluggishness of the courts. The people who braved tear gas, power hoses, and the cold of Delhi's harsh winters to spill into the streets were ordinary people, both men and women. Some may have identified as feminists, but some may not even have been familiar with the word in any language. They felt compelled to express their outrage not only at what happened on that December day, but at a growing culture of harassment of women and increasing incidents of rape in the city and in other parts of the country. Each and every rape is more than a statistic, and there's no national pride in pointing out that one's country does not have the highest incidence of rape in the world. Of course, in India, sexual assault is a crime that is notoriously underreported, so of course it is underrecorded. Given the physical and psychological violence of rape, statistics are not, however, the point. The single story that the press in the United States frequently tells about Indian women is that they are passive victims. Narratives of resistance are neglected, their agency is denied. In that erasure, many strong, confident, and courageous Indian women of all social classes are obliterated. The young woman in this case was given various names by the public and the press until her parents released her real name. Until then, the press referred to her as Braveheart. One of the most popular of her pseudonyms was Nirbhaya, which translates as fearless. Another was Damini or Lightning. Her real name, Julie. In India, she was seen as a symbol of courage and resistance. In many Western media accounts, she was a hapless and inert victim. Western media often use what Albert Memmi calls the mark of the plural, generalizing, essentializing, and speaking in monolithic terms. The New York Times refers to how India treats its women and girls as though they are all the same. The terms and language used in the reportage of the Delhi case recalls an acclaimed documentary film about female feticide in India, where Canadian filmmaker Karina Marceau asks, "What makes Indians fundamentally motivated to kill their daughters?" The statement is patently ridiculous, yet it passes without notice or comment. It implies that there is something inherent in the race, even if Indians are not a race. It reproduces 19th century notions of social Darwinism, that there's something fundamental in certain groups of people that causes them to behave as they do. There's little commonality between the situation of women from mostly matrilineal and often matriarchal Kerala and that of women in the so-called backward states. References to the Indian woman or even to Indian women thus become meaningless. NPR recently had a story on how India was such a dangerous place for women that subtly preyed on subliminal fears of the hypersexuality of dark-skinned men. While I certainly do not intend to minimize or to downplay the prevalence of rape, sexual assault, and harassment, the latter, euphemistically described in India as eve-teasing, To generalize the risks for all women in India in this manner is to make sexual violence against women about India rather than about sexual violence against women. In her seminal essay, Under Westernized, Chandra Talpade Mohanty talks about the third world woman as a single monolithic subject in some recent Western feminist texts, and talks about how these practices are inscribed in relations of power. Speaking on NDTV, which is an Indian 24 news channel, cable channel, a women's group leader said that the protests were not just about women's protection, but about women's autonomy. Kiran Bedi, a woman who retired as the nation's top cop, stated unequivocally, security in mobility for women is the first right she needs to be guaranteed. Failure to ensure this is clear failure of governance. But these are not usually the stories that are told in the media here. These are not the words that are reported. Emma O'Toole in The Guardian advises her readers to look westward, reminding them of the ghastly gang rape by high school football players of a 16-year-old girl in Steubenville, Ohio, not very long ago. Part of the outrage arose from photos and videos shared on social media that showed the 16-year-old victim inebriated at a post-football game party on the night she was assaulted. The perpetrators are now out of juvenile detention, and at least one is back on the football team. Interestingly, more people that I've talked to here in the US have heard of the Delhi rape than the Steubenville rape. The high rate of sexual assault in the US military and on college campuses, the expiration of the Violence Against Women Act for the first time in its history, Representative Todd Aiken's nefarious distinction between legitimate and illegitimate rape, and Pastor Mark Driscoll calling women penis homes, all make one wonder what entitles the West to wag its finger at India and scold. Of course, India has its own, very own Aikens and Driscolls. It's about the patriarchy, not the nationality. Indian media, which is alive with debate and discussion of all these issues, are for the most part not accessed here, so a critical counterpoint to the textual production of Indian women in Western media goes missing. Why not acknowledge instead that violence against women is a worldwide human rights issue that affects first world women as well as third world nations, and part of a larger struggle that takes in the exploitation of women's bodies in the context of economic imperialism and globalization? Why not make it about the issue itself rather than about the country? After all, Steubenville has not come to define the United States as the Delhi gang rape has come to define India. Why not come together to fight in solidarity instead of taking a stance of superiority? Why not use the lateral model advocated by Mohanty, where such violence would then be examined across countries and cultures? After all, violence against women has no borders. In her article, Emma O'Toole writes, there's something uncomfortably neo-colonial about the way the Delhi gang rape is being handled in the UK and US media. While India's civil and political spheres are alight with protests and demands for changes to the country's culture of sexual violence, commentators here are using the event to simultaneously demonize Indian society, lionize our own, and minimize the enormity of Western rape culture. It takes us back to 1811, when in his account of the writings, religion, and manners of the Hindus, one William Ward in 1811 appeals to women in Britain to rescue women in India from the accumulated miseries to which they are subject. In her book on the debate about sati in colonial India, Contentious Traditions, Lata Mani states that such writing typically represented itself as natural, effacing the context and conditions of its production. This continues to be the case with much of the media representation of issues concerning Indian women today. Malika Dutt, Executive Director, Breakthrough, an NGO that operates in India as well as in the United States, comments, "I'm a little irritated that somehow Indian men are now the poster children of brutality. That kind of racializing the whole colonial race hangover of creating categories of men gets away from the underlying issue. We are dealing with a patriarchal world where masculinity is completely out of control." And Eve Ensler, the author of the Vagina Monologues, commented that the newfound focus on violence against women has proved is never productive. Indian women are recolonized when the Western press battles with Indian men for their bodies, performing the trope of white men and white women in this case, saving brown women from brown men that Gayatri Spivak employs. Not all Indian women have access to media, of course. Not all can make their voices heard. But in the end, Indian women must speak for themselves, save themselves, rescue themselves, and represent themselves. Many are already doing that in solidarity with women around the world, but their powerful voices are effectively neutralized when they are faced and voided. Thank you.
I'm Purvi Mehta. Again, can everyone hear me? Because my voice is sometimes, yeah. So I wanted to thank the Center for Asian Studies again for organizing this, and also thank Dr. Rashna Singh for putting this panel together. In the interest of time, I'll probably just read my comments. In the days preceding the brutal gang rape and assault of a 23-year-old physical therapy student in New Delhi, a pregnant Dalit woman in Bhopal had been gang raped by 3 men on her way home from visiting her in-laws. A 17-year-old Dalit girl was gang raped in Haryana. Another Dalit minor was gang raped on her way to her grandmother's home. And a 17-year-old Dalit girl reported that she had been held captive and repeatedly raped by 10 men over the course of 9 days. All of these incidents occurred in December 2012. The other incidents I mentioned were relegated to the back pages of local and regional Indian newspapers. There is no large-scale feminist outcry, no new federal commissions or committees to study violence against women in India, and little to no coverage of these rapes in Western media. The mainstream coverage of the Delhi rape underscored 2 predominant themes that I see in the representation of Indian women. While the voices of Indian women's activism, defiance, and protest often go unheard in Western media, as Dr. Singh has just pointed out, the violence and abuse of other Indian women continue to go unnoticed. The rapes of the women I just mentioned, cases where rape is used to teach a lesson, coerce submission, or assert upper caste dominance, are deemed unremarkable and unexceptional. Similarly, the mass rapes of women in Kashmir and the Northeast by Indian security forces are largely ignored, both within India and abroad. My comments today will focus on this tension in the representation of Indian women. On one hand, Indian women are represented as passive victims of a patriarchal culture. On the other, there are forms of violence against Indian women that are completely invisible in this coverage. Starting with the coverage of the Delhi incident, I'll offer a genealogy to the persistent trope of women as victims, a genealogy with roots in the colonial period. I'll then turn to the issue of why certain women are excluded from the very category of victims. While this genealogy also has roots in the colonial period, it seems more related to other issues, and it's to those issues that I'll turn to at the end of my comments. Like the others on this panel, I was uneasy with most American coverage of the 2012 Delhi incident. In particular, the focus on India's culture of rape, rather than, say, its culture of feminist activism, reminded me of both the endurance of Orientalist discourse as well as of our continued reluctance to see third world women as agents of resistance and as agents who could teach us in the global north something about equality, rights, and social justice. This kind of coverage seems to be a legacy of colonial imaginings of India. Colonialism established political legitimacy by representing itself as the benefactor of modernity and civilization in India. In other words, the extraction and brute force of colonialism was concealed through a discourse that rendered India backwards and in need of political, economic, social, and moral uplift. In the colonial imagination, the apparent status of women indexed a community's level of civilization. Colonial officials strategically identified practices such as sati, child marriage, and enforced widowhood as indication of a degenerate and backwards culture. Throughout the 19th century, women's rights and wrongs were hotly debated by both colonial officials and Indian male elites, and it's through these debates, both popular and legislative, that we see the beginnings of a specifically colonial discourse on Indian women, a discourse that has been aptly described as white men saving brown women from brown men. Rape itself has been a powerful metaphor for empire. As theorist Jenny Sharp argues, the perceived sexual threat of brown or black men to white women indexed colonial fears and emerged most powerfully during times of political crisis. For the colonized, the use of the metaphor of rape highlighted the violence and exploitation of colonialism. Historian Elizabeth Kolsky argues, however, that far from being a mere metaphor, the crime of rape was also an important site of colonial jurisprudence. Kolsky suggests that many of the obstacles to getting convictions in rape cases today are legacies of colonial jurisprudence. For example, colonial evidentiary requirements remain strong today. In particular, its emphasis on the body and the requirement that the woman's body show evidence of resistance. Women were not active participants in the discussions on rape, sati, or child marriage in the 19th century. Neither their agency nor their subjectivity entered into the debates. Women, as Let the Money has shown, were the grounds on which debates about culture and tradition would be made. By the late 19th century, however, women began joining social reform movements, and by the early 20th century, we see autonomous women's organizations. And we can speak of women's activism, feminist activism, by the late 1920s. For example, organized women were instrumental in getting the Sharda Act passed, and they did so by opposing the colonial state and the religious orthodoxy. But despite this and many other acts of resistance, European and American representations of Indian women continue to portray them as degraded, subservient victims of a brutal culture. In discussions today, as in discussions during the colonial period, culture provides causation. In lieu of careful historical and social inquiry and analysis, culture offers explanation. Culture becomes the beginning and the end of understanding why or how something happens. For example, while many American commentators cited India's rape culture as the explanation for the 2012 case in Delhi, activists throughout India spoke of the effects of neoliberal capitalism on urban gender and class dynamics. For many activists, the glaring and conspicuous gap between rich and poor and the uneven distribution of wealth seemed to provide a more appropriate context for understanding the anger and misogyny evident in the 2012 crime. Another parallel between the colonial courtroom and contemporary coverage of violence against women is found in the significance of caste and class to evaluating whether an act was in fact rape. In colonial rape cases, lower caste and class women were assumed to be physically stronger and thus more capable of resisting rape. They were also perceived as more likely to make false charges. While this bias was formalized in colonial jurisprudence, it did not emerge from colonial policy. Rather, the bias against acknowledging violence against lower caste women seems more related to the specific gendered and sexual dynamics of caste hierarchy, dynamics which continue to erase the violence suffered by Dalit and other lower caste women today. Mainstream women's organizations in India have only recently begun to take seriously the issues and concerns of Dalit women. Dalit feminists, however, have been trying to get the Indian and international public to recognize the epidemic of sexual violence against Dalit women for decades. Dalit women across India continue to face retribution for their exercise of legitimate state-endowed powers and rights. This retributive violence is designed to reinforce traditional obligations and duties. It enforces social hierarchy, inscribes caste on the body, and functions to shame and subjugate the entire Dalit community. Here, rape becomes a mechanism for caste inequality. Sexual violence against Dalit women rarely makes it to the front pages of Indian newspapers, let alone American ones. Dalit women across India remain a category of women who are not only unheard, but also, despite the American penchant for the Indian victim in need of saving, are rarely even considered victims. Another category of violence that is routinely ignored in discussions of rape in India are rapes committed by Indian military and paramilitary forces in quote-unquote disturbed areas of the country. Despite evidence and documentation from human rights organizations, the Indian state has consistently dodged allegations of mass rapes by its security forces in Kashmir and in the Northeast. Very few Indian military soldiers have ever been arrested for rape, even though hundreds of women have been allegedly raped in both areas over the past 2 decades. Recently, after the rape of a 25-year-old Kashmiri woman by an Indian soldier in 2011, thousands gathered in Srinagar to protest what had seemed to become a calculated strategy on the part of the Indian state to use rape to humiliate, punish, and terrorize the local population. Neither the protest nor the story of the young woman received much attention in the media in America. The situation is not much better in the troubled Northeast, where Indian Army and paramilitary groups have been known to rape with impunity during their quote-unquote security operations in Assam and Manipur. In 2004, the rape and murder of a 32-year-old woman in Manipur instigated mass protests throughout the state. A group of elderly women, part of an organization called the Torchbearers, marched to the headquarters of the paramilitary group responsible for the woman's death, stripped naked, and dared the troops to rape them as they had the young woman. "We others have come," they announced. "Drink our blood, eat our flesh. Maybe this way you can spare our daughters." Neither their courageous resistance nor the rape and murder of the young women received much media coverage in the US. My point in discussing Dalit women, Kashmiri women, and Manipuri women is not to advocate for a more diverse representation of victims in the media, but rather to ask that we pay attention not only to how Indian women are represented, but to how sexual violence itself is represented. Certain crimes provoke outrage and protest within India and internationally, while other crimes go unnoticed. They are normalized and deemed unremarkable. And it is the erasure of these crimes and their victims that seems to be one of the most troubling issues in the mainstream coverage of Indian women. What is clear is that the simplistic notion of a, quote, culture of rape does not account for sexual violence against women in India. This notion is misleading not only because it assumes a timeless and uniform patriarchal Indian culture, but also because it ignores many important forms of violence against women in India today. It ignores history and the role of colonialism in distorting the image of Indian culture and Indian women. It ignores the intersections of caste, class, and gender that leave Dalit women so vulnerable to violence. It ignores the political economy of rape and the ways in which economic frustrations fueled by neoliberal capitalism are increasingly directed at women, especially young urban women. And it ignores the politics of rape and the consistent use of sexual violence as a weapon to counter resistance and coerce submission. Perhaps if we move away from reductionist descriptions like a culture of rape, we can learn more about the complexities of sexual violence against women in India and can begin to hear more diverse voices. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening, I guess. My name is Krithika Vachali. I'm a senior at Colorado College. Thank you so much for having us here, especially having me here on this panel. It's a great opportunity to talk. In June 2014, Andrew North wrote an article for the BBC entitled "How Rape and Violence Returned India to the Headlines." It's about gender inequality, discrimination, and violence in India. In this article, he quotes two famously misogynist male politicians, Mulayam Singh Yadav and his son Akhilesh Yadav, who say that boys will be boys and that as long as female journalists don't get raped, everything is okay. They also quote the Prime Minister Modi, who voices his politically correct opinions on how women in India should be protected. The only woman who speaks in this article is Rinda Grover, who is buried deep within it, almost hidden between paragraphs of horrific news of the Badan hangings and decisions against women by Kap panchayats, which often lead to honor killings. The women who are affected by these atrocities and women from the socioeconomic background of the victims are given no voice. They are silenced. The notion of Indian womanhood, gathered from these articles such as these, from reputable news media sources is that Indian women are victims to gender discrimination, that they are passive and voiceless, unable to speak, and helpless against the violence that is committed against them. The notion is not wrong, but when applied as a blanket statement about all Indian women, which happens, it is harmful. It is especially harmful to the women that are victims as well, because it essentializes them as eternally voiceless, instead of giving them the social ability to actually speak, which they do. These articles often render them unheard. As an Indian woman studying in the United States, I've often found myself in the uncomfortable position of either being told what I or India should do to solve gender-based issues, or in the position of being held accountable for gender inequality in India. On one hand, I am constantly defending Indian men and women against their representation in Western media, while on the other, I am critical of gender inequality within India and actively seek ways to create a change. Western mainstream media has essentialized the identity of Indian men and women in the aftermath of the Delhi gang rape in 2012 to the point that my critique against this portrayal is often taken to be tacit compliance with the gender norms that actually allow instances such as a rape to take place. It is not. The problem with buying into cookie-cutter media or cultural portrayals of an Indian woman is that she becomes an essentialized entity or trope that people use to relate to the real Indian woman that they encounter. This woman is inherently the victim, and then she is spoken about, rather than spoken to or allowed to speak in media portrayals of her. This portrayal is often at odds with women who speak up after violence, women who protest the violence, women who actively fight against the violence, and often none of their voices leave the subcontinent. Because of the silence of an Indian woman in news stories, the idea that all Indian women are silent takes roots. This means that every time I enter a conversation or any form of discourse, I not only carry the baggage of my past, but also have the essentialized Indian woman's identity thrust on me. This leaches my agency because I am no longer speaking from my perspective. I'm speaking from the perspective of the Indian woman whose identity I wear like an uncomfortable glove. I am not blind to my privileges. I have had access to education and belong to a familial structure that is free of gender discrimination. But this has often put me in a position, especially in the United States, of being perceived as the exception from a very patriarchal, oppressed norm, simply because I speak. I am not an exception. I'm a part of a group of vocal Indian women who are active agents in speaking out, if not acting out, against gender violence in India. And there are many instead of simply victimhood. In the aftermath of the Delhi gang rape, I often had people from the US and London, where I was last semester, talk to me about rape culture in India and characterize women in India as weak, subservient, and again, very much the victim. The message that I take away from this is very clear. It is more likely that my story as an Indian woman will be heard if I am a victim than if I am an active agent of social or political change. People are more likely to associate me with having to deal with sexual harassment on buses instead of a story about me working with NGOs that deal with trans rights. They would only be interested in the latter if I also included that I receive rape threats from politicians for doing so. I think then that it is important to change the story around a little, simply because the version of it being consumed here is largely misrepresented. It is also harmful. The propagation of a narrative where a woman is silenced is in itself a silencing mechanism. The Indian woman is not simply a passive victim susceptible to female infanticide, domestic abuse, or rape, though these threaten her safety and her existence. She's also a woman who goes into the streets to protest rape, who goes into work every day to earn her living, who works with NGOs and other organizations to make a difference, who stands for elections, who votes, who is part of grassroots organizations, who is a wage earner of her household, and who is trying to speak loudly enough to be heard. And she deserves to be. She has a right to self-definition and self-identification. She deserves to be heard speaking about the challenges she faces and her actions to overcome them. Media outlets thus need to create spaces for women to be heard instead of silencing them and writing narratives of violence and victimhood upon their bodies. Their agency and their triumphs deserve recognition. Neither I nor any other Indian woman should have to be a victim for the world to lend us its ears.
So again, thank you for having us here. I wanted to tie up, I'm the last panelist, so I wanted to tie up with what my previous panelists have already talked to you about. Dr. Singh here mentioned at the beginning of our panel discussion that we are dedicating this panel to our mothers who we have lost, but nonetheless, they are still in our lives because of the strong, the courageous legacy that they have left behind. So I just wanted to share with you a little personal story here. I'm not going to quote like 10 different people. I'm just telling you, as an Indian woman myself, what I had experienced and how it relates to this panel. So as a little girl in India, in the late 70s, sometimes my parents would bring Bollywood films, videotapes, and we would watch that. They were supposed to be family-friendly films, so we sat together and watched. But if you've seen any Bollywood films, you would know that it is unpredictable at times, and scenes change from happy, glorious dancing to suddenly a very violent scene and whatnot. It's hard to predict. But when what we noticed was, as a little girl, what I noticed was there used to be a stapled rape scene in most of these Bollywood films for whatever reasons. Gang rape or rape of a woman or whatever, but it used to be there in every film, and that used to be a very scary thing to me as a little girl. That has changed, by the way. Nowadays, the censor board bill stopped it from happening because it is politically incorrect to show a woman as a victim in every film. But nonetheless, it would scare me, and I would remember my parents frantically trying to forward those scenes because they didn't want us to have to see those. But nonetheless, I knew something bad is happening to these women, And there was this unease about growing up as a woman. Oh, so is this what's in store for us? Is this the fate of a woman? Is sometimes, what I would end up asking. And that's when when I would talk to my parents, my mother would often try to counter that and say, well, look, this is a movie, this is a plot, and okay, bad things happen in life, but there are good things that happen, and I want you to focus on the positive. I want you to focus on the stronger women. And because there was not much media representation of stronger women, my mother did take it upon herself to show me women who are strong, to go and meet them. Sometimes she'd just take me to some places where she thought, oh, she's an inspirational woman, you should see her, and you should talk to her, you should learn from her. So I'm trying to do some of that today here, believe it or not. As a scholar of Indian women, I do research women's social agency in India, how they change society and whatnot. But I'm taking this opportunity, this little time I have, very limited time that I have in this panel today. I want to show you faces and voices of some Indian women who I think are very courageous, very inspirational. And they are women who are not covered by the world media. The international media may not have heard of them. And I'm not talking about some women like, let's say, Vandana Shiva or Arundhati Roy, Indira Gandhi or Arundhati Roy in India. They are ordinary, so-called ordinary, but I don't think they're ordinary. I think they're extraordinary women, at least in the courage that they show and the way they're changing Indian society. I do want to give some credit to Indian media because they are trying to cover these women and the contributions of these women to society, but I think that we need more work. There's more work to be done in terms of having their voices be heard at larger venues. And I know that maybe these women will never actually end up in the Western media. So I'm taking this opportunity to cut short my talk, and I want you to see them rather than me. I have randomly found 5 women who I think will inspire you. This particular clip is of Kavita Ramdas. She is somewhat well known because she works for the Global Fund for Women. She has been invited for a TED Talk, so yes, she's definitely a little bit more better known. But the following women will be women who you may have never heard of, and maybe the Western media or the world media do not much care for. So let me start with Kavita Ramdas, and I want you to hear it from her own voice. So let's hear this. And I apologize I will cut it short because I don't have the time to show you the entire speech, but after the panel discussion, if you want me to give you more information about where to find this, I'm definitely willing to help you. So here's a little clip by an Indian woman who is an agent of change, I believe. Let's hear it from her. Okay.
Namaskar, good morning. Given my TED profile, you might be expecting that I'm going to speak to you about the latest philanthropic trends, the one that's currently got Wall Street and the World Bank buzzing. How to invest in women, how to empower them, how to save them. Not me. I am interested in how women are saving us. They're saving us by redefining and reimagining a future that defies and blurs accepted polarities. Polarities we've taken for granted for a long time, like the ones between modernity and tradition, first world and third world, oppression and opportunity. In the midst of the daunting challenges we face as a global community, there's something about this third way raga that is making my heart sing. What intrigues me most is how women are doing this, despite a set of paradoxes that are both frustrating and fascinating. Why is it that women are on the one hand viciously oppressed by cultural practices, and yet at the same time are the preservers of cultures in most societies? Is the hijab or the headscarf a symbol of submission or resistance? I can do this is tradition.
Okay, I'm going to stop this one here, but definitely you can tell that she's an amazing woman. You should hear the full talk. I'm going to move on to the next woman I've chosen for this panel here. Okay. All right. So her name is Mitra Communities, and now she's become one of their most vocal spokeswomen. She is saving thousands of tribal communities in India who have been marginalized by the mainstream government policies, as well as women we don't hear about much. But these are the women that counter the stereotypes that we often come across about Indian women. I do want you to take a look at what she, so let's, without wasting more time, let's see what she's done.
Haley would be the first girl in the Sarania community to get married. In this nomadic settlement of Arya in Gujarat, every girl is forced into prostitution by tradition. But Haley's marriage is putting an end to this regressive norm. And the one person responsible for this change is Mittal Patel. All of 30, Mittal Patel has made it a mission in life to work for the upliftment of more than 300 nomadic communities of Gujarat.
इन कम्युनिटी में खाने का भी प्रॉब्लम है. कई बार तो ये है कि कंटिन्यूस 2-3 दिन तक लोगों को खाने को नहीं मिलता है.
Mittal formed the Charta Samudaya Samarthan Manch and for almost 6 years has been working to get the nomads' voices to the government. She found that over 40 lakh nomads did not figure in any government records. Mittal and the team spent months to change this, and today 20,000 people from different settlements have got voter ID cards. This settlement in Disa celebrates as Mittal brings in good news. A letter of allotment of land for this community.
ये बहुत बड़ा अचीवमेंट मुझे लगता है कि उनको गवर्नमेंट रिजोल्यूशन हुआ उसके तौर पे उनको काफ़ी जगह पे लैंड मिलनी शुरू हो गई.
Mittal has started 31 tech schools where more than dreams that will become a reality one day, and this is Mittal Patel's vision.
Okay, so this was Mittal Patel from Gujarat. I purposely chose women who are from different parts of India so that it's you don't assume that it's just certain parts of India that are more progressive than others. She's from Gujarat, and the next woman I will show, I will skip a couple of slides and I'll go back to the older ones, but is from Manipur. And my colleague here, my panelist here, did speak about violence against women in Manipur, so that you can relate to that, the point that she made there.
Her name is Bina Lakshmi Nepram.
Hello and welcome to Season 4 of Real Heroes. I'm Shomdev Devvarman. Since my roots are from Tripura, today I'm extremely proud to present to you the real heroes from the east of India.
In Strike Torn Manipur, she's their only hope.
But behind their smile is sorrow.
Growing up in Manipur, Bina Lakshmi Nepram experienced how militancy had permanently scarred the mothers, wives and young daughters of her state. And it is for these very women that Bina Lakshmi has set up the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network.
Huidram Tanya is doing her graduation. She wants to become a nurse. Nutan is the master weaver of the traditional Manipuri fanik. And the person responsible for these small achievements is Bina Lakshmi Nepra.
These women are all smiling, but behind their smile is sorrow, which you and I cannot see.
More than 20,000 people have lost their lives in the killing fields of Manipur in the last 5 decades.
Every day 3 to 4 Manipuris are shot dead, and most of them are young men between the age group of 19 to 40, living behind young mothers, young women and their small children.
Bina Lakshmi's group, the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network, helps these women cope with their grief. Bina was just 9 when she saw 14 people massacred by security forces at this very playground.
Killing instantly this 13 people.
Then 20 years later, on the 8th of April 2005, insurgents burned down the school run by Bina's parents. But the biggest blow was the death of her niece in an IED blast in Imphal.
When we saw our niece's dead body, what can I say? Nobody, a 13-year-old child, has a right to live.
But Bina knew that the grief was not hers alone. Nutan was married for just 2 years with a newborn child when one day her husband simply vanished.
मेरे हस्बैंड जो थे उससे उसकी माँ से मिलने गई, बाजार गई थी, उस दिन से नहीं होती वो। जब हमारी कॉलोनी में एक कमांडो की बहन रहती है, उसने बोला मुड़ा कर डायरी देखो, फिर जाके देखा उसकी लाश वहाँ पे था। When I started meeting women, I knew that this is not fair to them. Forget about compensation. Nobody even bothered how they get on with their lives.
So Bina chalked out a strategy. She went village to village, opened bank accounts and gave these women interest-free loans and financial aid up to 9,000 rupees. Today they earn a living by making incense sticks, weaving or rearing fish. Each one of them is self-sufficient. Working with 80 women in 4 districts of Manipur, Bina gets most of her funding from donations and her research work with the Control Arms Foundation of India.
All right, so this is about Bina Lakshmi Nepram from Manipur, just as a woman single-handedly trying to change the status of women in Manipur and trying to help the oppressed. I will show you one more clip, and then I do have 2 more, but I don't know how we're doing on time. Okay, just maybe one more, and then we'll let it go. I'm going to show you a woman from rural India. Her name is, hang on, I'm going to, so Sampath Pal Devi, I don't know if some of you have heard about her, but she is a woman, a 51-year-old woman in rural India from the state of Uttar Pradesh, and she has formed a vigilante group to protect women. The women who are part of her group all wear pink saris. That's why they're called the Gulabi gang. Gulabi in Hindi means pink, the color pink. And they're the ones who go door to door to different houses to see if women are being oppressed or not. And if they do find any cases of oppression, then they go and fight. They actually carry sticks with them. So they're not relying on the government or the police or anybody. They are taking this in their own hands, because they know they have the courage to make this happen. And again, some people may criticize them for being vigilante groups, but nonetheless, I do want you to see that there are different forms, different ways that women in India are showing their agencies. These are women we do not hear about. So just one last clip about this woman, and then we can wrap this up.
In the nation, the safest feature in your car is you. At Vanishing Deductible from Nation.
Hello and welcome to the Unstoppable Indians, a show that is dedicated to ordinary Indians with extraordinary initiative, people who are changing India. On the show today, meet the Gulabi Gang, a group of women who are fighting for their rights and putting up a strong fight at that.
Going forward with this.
Their uniform is the pink sari. Their mascot is the danda. They voice their rights through slogans of strength.
There's some strong language there. I'm glad you don't understand.
This is the Gulabi Gang, led by Sampat Pal Devi, a force to reckon with in the Fatehpur district of Uttar Pradesh. Yes, Fatehpur, with 2,500 members, is the bastion of the Gulabi Gang. Banda is the Gulabi Gang's birthplace, but the gang's influence spreads across Uttar Pradesh, with one lakh 30,000 members across the state. Banda is at the heart of the Bundelkhand region, an area ridden by drought and poverty. Dacoits are rampant, and the
Okay, there's. I think I'll stop here. I do want you to research about these women on your own. These women are regular women in India. They're so-called ordinary women, but in their courage, they're extraordinary. I'm thankful to the Indian media for giving them some coverage, but I would definitely want the Western media to look into the contributions of these women too, when talking about South Asian women and women in India in particular. Speaking about rape and atrocity is very important. It is necessary, and just like Krithika said, I do feel strongly about it. I will probably be one of the first to go out there and talk about these issues myself. But in the process, I do not want it to be an incomplete picture of what reality is, because the incomplete version is always, it's partial information, it's misinformation, and that does not do anybody any good. So our goal here is to have a better picture of what women in India are doing. In fact, I teach women in my classes about the United States women's movement, and I tell them that, if I may say so, I think currently at this point in time, the women's movement in India is way more robust, way more voracious than the one we see here in the United States, which is news to a lot of my students because they don't see Indian women as active agents of change. And that is something I do, and I'm glad that I was part of this panel. Thank you very much.